way in which the Greek crisis then begins to transmit itself to Europe is the following. As Greece finds that it no longer can cover its government operations, the combination of central government operations and its state-owned enterprises, it's got to go out and borrow, or it's got to shut down. And a fifth of the workforce was in the public sector, and to shut down a fifth of the workforce was not an appealing proposition for an elected democratic government, conservative or progressive, right? So what they did was start to go back out in the market. As I say, the markets have begun to figure out that Greece probably wasn't as good a risk as Germany was, and so they wanted more money when the Greeks tried to issue new bonds. So now the Greeks have got a problem. They need to issue bonds in order to cover their current operating losses, and they need to roll over bonds that are coming due, that suddenly to roll them over, they're going to have to pay 2 to 3 times the level of interest they were paying on them when they previously issued them. And this then opens up a yawning hole in the Greek budget, because the budget consists not just of current expenses and current income, but also the servicing costs of debt over time. And so what the Greek government was faced with at the beginning of 2010, when I began working with them, was how to take this 15% of GDP hole in the government's deficit and bring it down very, very quickly. Now, one option would have been simply, well, we'll default, and our currency will drift downward against competing European currencies. Our cost will become much lower. People will come because it's cheaper to come to it. But no, wait a minute. We don't control our currency anymore. We're part of the Eurozone, so we can't do that. So the simplest economics recommendation that I would have made in another circumstance, which was float and let the drachma drop, wasn't an option available to the Papandreou government. In fact, once they had joined the euro, if you look at the governing articles of the European treaty that covers the euro, there is no section that covers leaving the euro. They just forgot that and left that out for some. You can join, but we have no mechanism for you leaving the club, right? So this presented a huge crisis for the Greeks. And in fact, devaluing was not such an attractive option for the following reason. Over the last 30 years, a country that had been self-supporting in terms of food production was now importing 45% of all of its food. And if you drop to a drachma that falls to half the level of what the euro was, your food price for imports doubles. So think of what that does to average or working class or poor families when the price of food doubles if you leave the drachma. Greece doesn't produce any cars, doesn't produce any trucks. They import them from Germany, from Japan, from Korea, from Poland, from elsewhere. So the cost, well, for wealthy Greeks, the cost of a Mercedes went from $70,000 to $140,000. For the average Greek, a $15,000 euro car would now cost 30,000 euros. Not only would the price of the car have doubled, but because Greece has no indigenous oil supplies, gasoline would have doubled as well, and they're already paying $7.50 a gallon for gasoline. How would you like to pay $15 a gallon for? Boy, if you want the incentive to go to electric cars, you got it right there, 15 a gallon. Think how America would deal with $15 a gallon oil. And that's euros, so think of that as actually $22, 15 euros or $22 a gallon. So the opportunity cost associated with leaving the euro and going to the drachma were pretty challenging. Pretty challenging. The downside risks were really enormous. And so what the Prime Minister did was say, no, we're staying in the euro. But he didn't do it just out of a cynical kind of understanding of it will cost us more if we leave. He did it because he's part of a generation that actually believes that European unification is better than European nationalism. He'll have an article out shortly in The Economist on the world in 2020 about why he's doing what he's doing and staying to fight for keeping Greece in the Eurozone. And it begins with the sentence, when I think of Europe's future, I remember Europe's past. And he recalls that while he was born after the Second World War, the stories that his parents and his grandparents told him about what it was like in the First and the Second World War in Europe. or the period between the First and the Second World War, or the long dark period of the first 20 years after the Second World War, as Europe climbed out of the devastation and ashes of the Second World War. Europe knows a lot about nationalism. A lot about nationalism. And the dangers of European nationalism are not in the distant past. The Balkans in the 1990s are a simple evidence of that. You don't need to spend a lot of time talking to Poles about their fears of the Russians on one border and the Germans on the other to realize that national fears are large and real in the minds of lots and lots of people. And having the euro and having the Eurozone there to gradually bind together the economic interests of these diverse peoples, even as you hold apart their national governing systems, their culture, their language, is an important part of what makes Europe a much more stable place as we look at it going forward in the 21st century.